Hello, it's me, Ariza Gaming, and welcome back to another episode of Sandbox Showcase, the series where I talk about problems in Oxygen Not Included and how to solve them easily and efficiently. So today we're going to talk about rust again. It's a pretty interesting material, and we've done a video in the past where we talked about using a rust deoxidizer to separate out into oxygen and iron ore, which is very helpful if you need a source of A, oxygen for your dupes to breathe, and B, metal ore for your construction purposes. You need to combine it with a bit of salt and you'll get some chlorine out. We use the dash of salt mines to help recycle the chlorine, so we consume less salt along with the rust, and that's all well and good. But if you want to actually get refined iron out of this, if you were going to use a metal refinery on the iron ore, for every 750 kilograms of rust you're putting in, you'd only get out 400 kilograms of refined iron, which is just over 50% of the mass. And if you don't actually care about the oxygen, or if you don't actually have a lot of salt available to grab and use in these machines, you might just want to turn the rust directly into iron. And the key is you can actually do this. So if we have a look at the material here, it melts at about 1538 degrees in practice into iron at a 1-to-1 ratio. And then you can just cool it back down again, and then you've got the iron metal to build everything out of. So that's pretty convenient. And today what I want to do is I want to talk about how you can set up a build that efficiently melts the rust straight into iron and then cools it back down via a heat exchanger. So you've got nice, coolish, room temperature-ish iron for your dupes to use to build stuff with. And the reason I want to talk about this topic today, rather than, well, a while ago when I talked about the rust deoxidizers, is you're now going to have access to a reliable rust source if you have the prehistoric Planet Pack DLC. The Jorbos actually eat Pacu fillets and they produce rust. They produce 60 kilograms per cycle, that's 0.1 kilograms per second per Jorbo. We very recently did a video covering this topic, but in essence, if you have 3 Jorbos in a tank and you have 6 Pacu breeders that are feeding them, you're actually going to be producing the same amount of refined iron from the rust they produce as an iron volcano. And then if you multiply that by 2, then you have as much as a geodude iron volcano. You can get a very large amount of rust because the Pacu are relatively easy to feed with the Prehistoric Planet Pack DLC and the Seacomb Leaf. So you could get massive amounts of rust being produced, and you may not necessarily want all of the oxygen that comes out of this, and you may not necessarily have enough salt being produced elsewhere in your colony to actually match up with that. Even if you're not playing with the Prehistoric Planet Pack DLC, the rust will still spawn in pretty large tiles, 800 kilograms-ish on average. And when you dig that out, you're going to get 400 kilograms of rust, which you can turn into 400 kilograms of iron. Alternatively, if you're feeling really creative, you can actually just, like, say, find a nearby magma volcano, have it erupt all over the rust, and then actually melt it directly into iron without having to actually dig it up. But what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about a rust melter build that doesn't rely on a volcano or some other map-dependent heat source that could be somewhat cumbersome to incorporate into your general buildings. We're just going to use a regular metal refinery with some techniques that we already know about, and we're going to set it up so you can produce as much or as little iron from your rust as you want in a way that you can scale up pretty easily and in a way where you can actually access all the parts of the build. So yeah, let's get into it. So we're back, we've cleared out some space. Now let's set up the overall layout of this rust melter design. So we're going to set up a metal refinery room over here that the dupes will have access to. This could be just part of your dupes' regular base, so they can go in and out, they won't necessarily need Atmos suits. All the inputs and outputs should be cold. But we're going to have the heat exchanger up here, and this is where we're going to be doing the actual melting of the rust into iron and then cooling it back down. So we're going to put a metal refinery. This is going to be the initial heat source that we're going to use to get the rust up to melting temperature. Let's make it out of igneous rock. If you have ceramic, that's pretty good, but you don't necessarily need it. We're going to put a lamp in here so we can get the lit workspace bonus. Very important for your dupes. If you don't have a high operating attribute, it gives a flat plus 15% boost to operation speed, so that's pretty handy. And then we're going to put a few Mechatronics bits over here. So we're going to put an auto sweeper over here. Again, these don't have to be made out of steel. These could be made out of regular materials. And then We're going to put a conveyor loader here. This is where we're going to get the dupes to manually put the rust in. So we're going to set this to allow manual use, and then we're going to hook it all up. We're going to put a chute over here, and this chute is where we're actually going to dump all of the iron that comes out of the rust melter. And they can put it straight in the metal refinery, and they can combine it with the refined carbon and the lime that they're going to use for steel production, and we can just use this to make steel directly from the iron. So I think that's a pretty good way of generating the heat for that as well. Producing steel with the metal refinery produces the most heat per operation, so it makes sense. And then there's a few other things we're going to put in. We're going to put in a liquid lock. So this is going to be made with sort of normal tiles over here. And then we're going to continue these insulated bits over here. So this is the point where... Hold on. Yeah, this is the point where the dupes are no longer going to want to have regular access. So what we'll do is we'll put some liquids in here. Any liquid will do. The heat exchanger for the rust melter will actually be in a vacuum. So you don't need to have a vacuum lock here, just a big old blob of water will do. In fact, the bigger the better, because you really don't want it to actually boil. And we're going to use it as a little bit of a heat sink for the final products as well. That's why we made it out of granite, these sort of conductive tiles. And then what we're going to do here, importantly, is we're going to put a door in here so we can restrict access. Obviously, while the dupes are building everything, they can come in here. And then once everything's built, you'll probably want to restrict access until dupes have exosuits, or possibly you can make this room a little bit longer and add an exosuit terminal if you really need to, or just manually put a dupe in a suit and then get them to come in here and do emergency maintenance if needed. But the door is important. It doesn't really matter what material you make it out of. Even if a door breaks, it will actually still function properly, so you don't need to worry about that. And then we're going to put a few more bits in here, and we'll explain what these do later, but I'm just going to show you the buildings. We're going to be using meter valves and meters a lot for this. We've learned a fair bit about meters in our time with Oxygen Not Included, and we learned a lot about conveyor meters fairly recently. But we're going to put a liquid meter valve up here. You're going to need plastic for this. We're going to use this so we can dump in precise amounts of liquid for when we need to actually heat up the rust. Because as the heat exchanger gets more and more efficient and runs for longer, we'll need less and less input materials. So this is a case where ordinarily we would have a liquid valve and we'd have like a small amount of liquid constantly trickling through, but we can actually automate this as well. So that's why we're going to use a meter valve in this case. Similarly, we're also going to use a conveyor meter down here, and this is actually going to lead the rust on, and we can use that to restrict the amount of rust we're putting in each conveyor packet. The smaller packets of material are much more conductive, so this is pretty important. And then we're going to actually put a bottle drainer in here as well. You don't necessarily have to, but I'm going to do this because of the liquid we're actually going to use as our coolant for the metal refinery. So we're just going to stick that here. Doesn't matter what that's actually made out of. And yeah, that's most of the buildings for this sort of initial area. What we want to do as well, we actually want to set this reset port so it's constantly on. There's a couple of ways we can do this. But essentially, we're doing this so that we can just use the conveyor meter as a valve, because the conveyor valve does not exist. They only have the meter. So we don't actually need to automate this port. So you can do a few things. You can either set up an automation wire here, then just have a signal switch, and then just flip it on, and then that's going to constantly reset it so it constantly outputs a fixed amount of solids onto the packets. But you don't even need a switch. You can actually just take the port, put it over here, and then put a NOT gate on it. If you do it like that and you put a wire on the other end, like this, it will flip this end green. And that's how you can get a green signal without taking up any space in your build. So we're going to have this hidden NOT gate here. But you can use a signal switch for it as well if you want to turn it on and off. That's absolutely fine. We might actually put, like, say, a conveyor receptacle in here, and then you can actually dump some more input materials into this room this way. You can even put another one. Over here if you feel so inclined. So you could actually have that all in range of your auto sweeper. You could have the refined carbon in this one. You could have the lime in this one if you really feel like it. And that's how we're going to organize the space in here. So we've talked a lot about a heat exchanger. What is this actually going to look like? Well, The reality is, you can do heat exchangers in a lot of different ways. So the way I'm going to show you here is one that your dupes can access at any time, in case you need to do some maintenance on something. And you can extend it to be as large as you want. The larger your heat exchanger is, the more efficient it's going to run. And essentially what we're going to do is, the principle is, we're going to have 2 conveyor rails. We're going to have one conveyor rail full of incoming rust that starts cold and heats up. And then we're going to have one conveyor rail of iron that's going to come out. It's going to start hot, and it's going to cool down against the rust. So you want to have... because we've got 2 different conveyor rails in this case, you want to have a 2-tile, like a 2x1 element that will exchange heat. So I'm going to use diamond tiles in this case because A, they're transparent so you can see what the rails are doing, and B, they're very conductive. You don't necessarily have to use diamond, but you do have to use a material that's not going to melt under rust melting temperatures. So don't use granite for this, and definitely don't use aluminium for this. Obsidian is another good material to use for this. But what you do is you separate it out into little blocks. And what will happen is the closer each block is, we're gonna edit this in a minute, I'm just illustrating this. The closer the block is to the incoming rust to start with, the colder it will be. So this would be sort of the cold end, and then as the iron's coming in, this rust will get hotter and hotter as it loops around on these rails. So it'll get hotter and hotter as it loops around onto these rails until you get to the final bit where you're injecting the heat, and we're going to inject it directly above the metal refinery in this case. And then it's going to cool down again. The longer the heat exchanger is, the more efficient it's going to be at heating up the rust and preheating it before it actually gets to the melter. So we're going to have a few of these different elements here, and then we're going to stop it over here. So we're going to send these insulated tiles, we're going to send them all the way around here. And the way we're setting up our build, you can fill these ones in as well. I was trying to think of how you could actually fit this all in a sort of 4-tile high room layout style arrangement like we typically do. Because the idea is that we're just going to have this sat next to the base where the duplicates are doing all of their normal stuff, all of their normal tasks. I couldn't quite get it to fit properly, but this is... You're going to have a lot of tiles for heat exchange in this arrangement. I'm pretty happy with it. So we're going to keep putting them up here, and the reason I'm staggering them out like this is because the dupes can actually climb in and out of these gaps. So you can put a few ladders in there. I'd recommend making them out of stuff that won't melt easily, like obsidian's probably a good idea. You will actually need to... I think you actually need to remove this insulated tile. That's fine. Yeah, you'll need to remove this insulated tile so you actually have access up here. But what you can do is you can put, like, say, a ladder sort of here. Yeah, if you put ladders here, and then if we spawn in... No, not a Jorbo. A duplicate. Just spawn on a normal duplicate. So, you can see now, that duplicate can climb up and down all of these ladders, and we'll get rid of the critter. So the duplicate can climb up and down all these ladders, so they can access the whole area with the heat exchanger. I'm going to put a couple more diamond tiles over here as well. We're going to use those later on. But yeah, essentially we can just run the conveyor rails through this whole segment, and there's a lot of diamond tile volume and a lot of discrete steps at which we can exchange heat between the incoming rust and the outgoing iron, and this means we can run it very efficiently. So we can get this... By the time the rust actually gets to the end of the heat exchanger over here, it's going to be very hot and practically on the cusp of melting. The closer we can get it, the better. So yeah, that's what that's going to look like. There's a couple more details we're going to put in because this is the actual melting area. So, first of all, I cannot restrain myself any longer. I'm going to recommend that you use liquid uranium for this build. It's great. Any material that's a liquid at around 1500 degrees C can be used for this, but I love to use liquid uranium in all these builds because A, it's a viscous conductive metal, and B, it's a liquid from about 135 degrees onwards. So you absolutely can just have it like be a liquid for like most of the actual construction phase and then the initial operation. It's way less temperamental than other high temperature liquids. And we're going to use this to actually directly melt the iron. And also to cover up a thermosensor. The long and short of it is, we're going to have a tile of liquid uranium right here. And we're going to have a thermosensor in here. And this is going to tell us when to eject the coolant and when not to eject the coolant. Because if the setup is too cold, the rust won't melt, and it's going to be recirculating the rust until it does melt. So at that point, we want to inject liquid. But if it's hot enough that it's melting, we don't need to inject any more liquid. And we're going to use the meter valve to eject it at a fairly slow rate so that we can run it fairly constantly. There's a few other things we're going to put in here. So let's put an airflow tile over here. Yes. Doesn't matter what material you make this out of. It's going to be in a vacuum. It's not going to exchange any heat. If you want to be really careful, then just make it out of steel. So we'll have a steel airflow tile here. That way, no matter what happens, even if we get some liquid iron, or if we get a gas in here that's conductive, it's not going to melt. But you shouldn't get any gas in here. We're going to put another auto sweeper in here. I would recommend making these elements out of steel. Again, it's going to be a vacuum, so you don't necessarily have to, but just in case, you don't really want all of your equipment melting if there's a malfunction. So that's going to go here. And what you'll notice is if we put the auto sweeper here, it can reach this tile, and it can reach this tile. These are the two tiles where we're going to get liquid iron forming from the rust melting. So that's why we're putting it there. And then we're going to put in another conveyor loader. That's just going to take the iron up, and then we're going to put another conveyor meter up here as well. Conveyor meters don't overheat, by the way. I'm building it out of steel so we don't accidentally melt it, but you never have to actually worry about them overheating. So that's good, because we're going to have to put some cooling in here later for these items. And then the last thing we're going to do buildings-wise is we're going to put a hydro sensor over here. You want to make that out of steel. You definitely want to make that one out of steel, because that's going to be where the liquid iron is. And then we're actually going to put a steel door up here, a steel mechanized airlock. And the reason we're doing that is we're going to connect these two items. It's just so that if we get to the point where there's a lot of liquid iron building up in here, you can shut this door, and then it will transfer some of the heat over from between these two items, and that should cool the iron back down. It's a failsafe that generally won't be used, but I like to build it in anyways. And yeah, that's more or less all of the buildings and the overall layout for this whole room. So now let's actually move on to the mechatronics, so this actually makes a little bit more sense. And then we'll set up the rest of the details. So we need rust. We need rust to go in here. Okay, I'll tell you what. We'll come back once we've spawned all the materials we actually need. So, we've got our rust, we've got our refined carbon, and we've got our lime, just coming out of some conveyor things over here. We also did make sure, by the way, to vacuum out this whole room. That's very important. Stick a gas pump in here before you put in all the tiles. Maybe stick in a couple within your region. Just pump all the gases out. You do not want any gases in here at any point. But yeah, now that we've set it all up and we've actually got the materials, let's actually set up some of the conveyor loaders and whatnot. I guess we'll plug in some power first. Doesn't really matter how we're going to power this. Put a load of conductive wires. Make sure that you don't put any bridges going over insulative elements. You do not want to accidentally leak heat from any of this. So that's going to go in there. We're going to fill this up with rust, and that's going to be manual. So we've got some dupes over here. They should just be coming over here and dumping some rust in. We're going to take this conveyor and we're going to hook it up here, just to the meter. And for this meter, for now, we're going to set this to 1 kilogram. So this is going to send 1 kilogram packets of rust along our rust conveyor rail. And then we're going to move that down here. So we're going to run this cold rust, starting off cold. It'll come out of the Jorbos cold as well if you're using the Prehistoric Planet Pack DLC, so don't worry about that. We're going to send that rust all the way over here. And then we're going to put in a conveyor bridge. I'm gonna make this out of steel. Any elements that you have in here, you're probably going to want to make out of steel if you have it. If you don't, then something else that's relatively high melting point, like wolframite, could be a good idea. but you don't want to put any metal components in here that are going to melt if there's a sudden gas release. So yeah, let's actually make, let's just, for the purposes of this video, let's make everything out of steel. Late game, you'll have access to lots of steel anyways, because it's a renewable material. Because you're going to be able to produce it from refined metal. You're going to have the iron to produce it from this build. And you may have an iron volcano that you can start off with. So that's going to come down here. We're going to put a bridge up here. We're going to use conveyor bridges to negotiate and navigate the conveyor rails through quite a specific formation. So that conveyor rail is going to run through here, and then it's going to go up. And then it's going to run through the bottom here. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the rust running through the bottom of all of these 2x2 elements at all times, except for these ones. You don't actually need these two, but we'll get to that in a minute. So then this is going to go up here, and then we're going to put another conveyor bridge in here. The conveyor bridges help lead the material in the right direction, but it's also so we can actually navigate the material around everything without having to go through these little gaps between the tiles, because we don't want any heat to leak over from materials being transported over the top of tiles. Don't ask me why it transports heat. We actually found some issues with that with the phosphorus melting design that we did a while ago. In any case, it's going to come back over here, and then this is where it starts to get a bit wild. So this rail is going to go all the way to the final element. That makes sense, doesn't it? Then we're going to send it down here onto this tile. This tile shouldn't actually exchange heat with anything other than the liquid iron down here, and there shouldn't be liquid iron down here a lot. It should mostly be debris. So even though it's directly above the tile, there should be relatively little heat exchange. We're then going to have a bridge here, and we're going to lead it on a conveyor rail into the insulated tile. Do not put a conveyor rail bridge into the insulated tile, or you're going to transfer heat to the insulated tile very quickly, and then that's going to transfer it slowly to your base. Any bridges that go through insulated tile need to be from insulated tile to insulated tile. So that's why the bridges are going to look a bit funky for this. It's going to come down here, and then we're going to run it all the way along these tiles. And it's going to come up, and then this is where it's going to actually enter our melting section. So this is where we're going to be dumping the heat in from the metal refinery coolant. So at this point, it should actually melt. So what we're going to do is we're going to get it to this airflow tile. We're then going to put a bridge on here. So the two bridges overlapping each other. And then what we're actually going to do is that rail is going to come down here and connect onto this port like this. You can't see it, but that's what it looks like. So any rust that doesn't get hot enough to melt, because it should melt by the time it gets over here and just fall off as iron debris or liquid iron over here. But if it doesn't, it will get on that bridge, and it will, because this is first in the new rail from here, it will prioritize loading the rust from here and continuously running the loop to make sure everything's still heating, as opposed to dumping more rust onto the system via this horizontal bridge. So that's all the conveyor rail stuff for the rust. Then we have a loader down here. So this loader is where the iron is coming in. We're going to lead that conveyor rail outwards to the middle of this bridge. And then this bridge is going to go up. And that is then going to just lead directly into the meter, which we're also going to set to 1 kilogram per second. You want to keep these two at the same setting, believe it or not. We want a net zero of rust in to iron out. And then the simple part is we just run the iron conveyor all the way over here. And we're going to put a couple more bridges. This one's going to be a little odd. It's going to go down here, and then it's going to go down here. And then we're going to lead it around this way. But that's fine, because again, there should be no heat exchange on this tile. And this is going to run over here. We could just run this conveyor rail straight down here. One thing I would say is there is going to be a little bit of... There's going to be the water here, so if you put the conveyor rail here, like we had in our original build, there might be a little bit of heat exchange. So what we'll actually do is we'll put the bridge one tile higher up. We'll go over here. And then that's going to come into this element this way. And then we're going to lead it along this way. And then the iron is going to come back down here, and it's going to run along the insulated tile for this bit, at which point the iron is mostly cool, because it's going through these final bits. when this is continuously operating, the iron and rust is going to be sort of about 100 to 200 degrees in this region, and then it's going to get down to room temperature in this region. So at this point, the iron is cool enough to be safe to go through here. And what we will do is we will actually just lead it up here into the chute, and then it can just dump out the chute. And that's all of the conveyor rails for the rust going in and the iron coming out. So I hope you're paying attention during this bit, because it is not clear from the overlay what is going on there. But if you rewatch it if needed. We're going to have this set to refined carbon. We're going to have this set to lime. And then those are the two other materials that you're going to have for your steel production. They're going to come in here. So let's get this manually loaded with rust, and then you can just see what I mean. And this is fine to do at the beginning. So as you can see, we're letting out 1 kilogram packets of rust at a time. Now these elements are all at 20 degrees C. This uranium here is a little bit hot because we spawned a little bit hot, but generally the room's cold at the moment because we just built stuff in it. It's a vacuum. But the rust is just going to lead all the way through here. I will take a sip of my coffee as it does so. So this is what it's going to look like when it's loading in the material. And then you can see it comes through the rail here. It comes onto this loop. And then you'll see what happens because this obviously isn't melting at this point. This loop stops and it runs through here. And it actually doesn't seize at all, which I'm pretty pleased by. So this is what it will look like when it's waiting to melt the rust. This rust is all actually heating up off of the uranium at the moment. The temperature of the hot uranium is decreasing, but this isn't going to be enough to actually melt the rust at all. This is probably going to be enough to actually freeze the uranium, but we'll see. Anyways, now for the next part. So let's actually set up the rest of the automation, because the automation isn't that complicated. So what we want to do, again, on this port, we also want to add a NOT gate, just so that it's constantly running. We would be using a regular conveyor, we would be using a regular conveyor valve for this if they existed. So by tricking it with a NOT gate, you can just have it always reset, and it can always let out the 1 kilogram per second. Or if you really feel so inclined, you can just set up a signal switch over here, and then you can plug it in, and then you can actually, you know what? I think I will do that just so that you actually can control it later. Like, we do have room for all of this. Like, just in case you want to turn it off, you can turn it off with the signal switch. You can just do it like that. So yeah, that's absolutely fine. And then the rest of the automation. So we're going to set this thermosensor so it lets in the coolant liquid if it's below, if the liquid uranium is below 1,538 degrees C. And that's going to make sure that it's always heating up to rust melting temperature, believe it or not. We're going to set this to, say, I don't know, about 50 kilograms. The iron will not form a tile here unless it forms multiple hundreds of kilograms. So you should be safe normally from it condensing into a tile, but 50 kilograms is a reasonable threshold. We're closing this door and rapidly cooling it off of the next element in here. You shouldn't need more than one, but if you really wanted to, you could hook up multiple in series, but I digress at this point. And then we have the liquid meter valve. So we're going to use this to control how much liquid is flowing in. And I'm going to set this to about 0.3 kilograms per second of refinery. Because of refinery coolant. Because each operation of the refinery produces 400 kilograms of heated coolant. This means that this can run for 2 days, heating continuously before another errand needs to be done. But the amount is just the amount that I feel works pretty well for 1 kilogram per second of rust. If you're melting 1 kilogram per second of rust into iron, that is the equivalent of more than 3 iron volcanoes, or 10 jawbones. So that's a fairly large amount of rust. We can increase it further, but that's a fairly large amount of rust, a fairly large amount of iron production. You're probably not going to need more than that unless you're doing some crazy shenanigans. So it's a good starting point. But yeah, that's literally all of this. Oh, we just want to set this to iron. Yeah, we'll just set it to refined metal. That's fine. And then the actual thermosensor should plug into the heater. That makes sense. Yeah. So that's literally all of the automation. It's not very complicated for a change. You've got to use the valves, you've got to use the plastic. That's what you got to do. So now for the final phase, we're going to put in the liquid loops, and we're going to put 2 liquid loops in. We're going to put in a regular coolant loop we're just going to use to cool down the auto sweeper and the conveyor loader in this room where all the hot metal is being handled. And then we're also going to set up the metal refinery coolant loop that I've been talking about for this entire video. So first of all, let's just dump some polluted water in here. That's a pretty good temperature range, pretty good heat capacity. It's more or less what we're looking for. So we're going to put a little bridge in here. And then we're just going to send this loop down here. I'm just going to use insulated pipe for the whole thing because I don't want to really risk it for a biscuit, if I'm being honest. So that is going to go in a few different ways. So first of all, I'm actually going to run it this way. We're going to dump it down here. And then we're going to dump it down here. And I'm actually just going to run this through some radiant pipe. You can use aluminium for this, that's fine. Aluminium is the most conductive metal. Steel will do, any refined metal will do. So we're initially going to dump heat into this water because that's going to exchange heat with the rest of the map, and it's going to make sure the liquid stays cool. You're not actually generating a huge amount of heat from this auto sweeper and loader, but because they're in a vacuum, you do have to dump the heat out somewhere, so you might as well dump it here. And then we're just going to send the liquid around here. So through these tiles where nothing's going on. And then we're going to use some conduction panels. So we're going to make these out of probably steel, again, just in case. So we're going to put one here for the auto sweeper, and we're going to put one here for the loader. You do not need a conduction panel for the meter, because the meter will not overheat. And it doesn't generate any heat. So that's going to go there, and then this is just going to go here. And then because this is bridging on, that's going to form the basis of the loop. So that polluted water is going to run around, exchange into here, and then immediately start cooling these items down. Not that they're hot at the moment anyways. And as you can see, because we're putting the bridge on at this point, it just stops filling when it's full. And then it will just run like this. No shenanigans. So the next bit is for the actual uranium itself. So what we're going to do is, first of all, if you happen to have any uranium ore that you melted on the map for anything else, you can just dump it into this meter via a bottle drainer. I find it quite handy. Can be a good way to load everything up. So that is going to cut all of the coolant from the metal refinery is going to come out here, and it's going to come out here. But what we're actually going to do, instead of heating up the metal, we're going to heat up the tile. Because what we actually want is for we want most of the iron to melt over here rather than over here. Because if it melts over here, it's displacing the uranium. It's kind of annoying. And I would rather have it melt over here. So if we put the radiant pipe, and we're going to make this a steel pipe. We put the radiant pipe here. This tile will be hotter than this liquid. So provided that this thermosensor is active and it's always just around the rust melting temperature, it should all melt over here because it will be hot enough to actually conduct the heat to the rust in this region. It won't be hot enough because it's passing over very briefly. It won't be hot enough in this region, but that's fine. So then all we need to do is take this down here, and then we just lead that back into the metal refinery. You can actually put a liquid reservoir tank if you want as well, or a few different tanks, but you're probably not going to have that much coolant. Going to put the pipe over here, and then we're going to have a bridge here. So wherever we're loading it from, it's going to come after the metal refinery in the pipe, and then it's just going to go up here. And that's it. If we have any excess in the pipe, we can put a vent in if we need to, but I don't think we really need to. So that should actually let us dump in the coolant. So let's actually just watch that happen. It's coming out of this at about 186 degrees, so it's going to start off relatively cool. Heating up now, obviously. I love how this little thing spins. So that's going into the metal refinery, that's all good. We're going to need a little bit of iron just to get this going. And then we can get everything working, so I can show you just how this actually operates. So we'll do that, and I'll see you in a minute, before everyone pees themselves. So what we're going to do, just while this is filling up, I'm going to 50-50 the input liquid uranium in here, just so we can fill this metal refinery up a little bit faster. Just get our initial stockpile of metal in here so that we can do the work. I'd recommend putting in about 800 kilograms, because then someone can do the errand, and then you've still got like another bit left to recirculate. So we'll load up about that much. That'll do. So let's actually disconnect this now. And then all of the remaining liquid uranium is just going to come in through this pipe here. So as you can see, that's been heated up by 134 degrees. So this is heating up. We just had the initial cold segment stuck in here, and then this is going to run through here. We can set this to start at 10 kilograms per second just to initially allow the material to recirculate. We're going to have to generate a fair bit of heat from this just to get it up to temperature to start with. But once we do, we'll be right back, and then you'll see this thing actually working. So we'll be back in a minute. Maybe I'll build some actual facilities for these dupes. Right, we're back. So the liquid uranium is now very hot. It's considerably hotter than rust melting temperatures. The tile over here is now just about hot enough to melt rust. This uranium is a little bit less hot. But something very important to point out. You need to make this pipe segment specifically out of ceramic. Otherwise, it's just going to melt if it's made out of igneous rock as soon as you get the first lot of rust melting. Ideally, all of the pipe that's handling liquid uranium should be ceramic. But you can see we just had our first lot of rust melt. It's formed a nice little blob of iron over here. It's we've got the airflow tile here to make sure that when the iron is a liquid, it doesn't flow onto the conveyor loader. But now, because it actually exchanges heat with the rust on this conveyor belt segment, it does immediately condense off of that. And you can see that's getting loaded in to the conveyor loader. So if we have a look at this, it's currently around 1,300 degrees. So it's cooled by about 200 degrees immediately just because of contact with this rust, which is not ideal, but that's fine. So now that iron is now running through this conveyor. You can see it starts off hot and it cools very quickly because it's currently heating up all of these heating elements. And then we'll see the actual heat exchanger working in full swing. Now at this point, we can actually set this pipe to less uranium because we don't need to have all of this uranium going into here. We don't need to transfer all of this heat over here. If we transfer too much heat into this, you're going to get some iron forming over here, which is not the end of the world. But the reality is, the higher the number is on this, the more uranium is just being cycled back into here. So if you want to make more steel, if you want to have more metal refining errands going on, set this to high value. But if you just want this to run and you don't mind the steel being made at a slightly lower rate than just having the iron available, set this lower. So I'm going to set this back to 0.3 kilograms per second like we had it before. So now you'll see what happens. The uranium is the same temperature, but instead of decreasing in temperature by, say, 30 degrees, it's decreasing all the way down to sort of the rust melting temperature. So this way we're getting the most bang for our buck out of this. We're getting the most heat exchanged relative to the amount of metal refinery errands that need doing. So our dupes don't have to constantly be refining metal to make this. They can refine a very small amount of metal and it'll still provide enough heat for all of this. But yeah, the longer this runs, the more efficient this will be. So if we go over and have a look at all these different window tiles. So at the moment, only these ones very close to the actual melting zone are actually heating up. But the longer we run this, the more they'll all heat up and the more efficiently the heat will get transferred. So if we have a look at the moment, this rust over here is preheated to 230 degrees coming through here. So these are more or less at the 20 degrees they started off at. But the longer this runs, the further you get over here, the more temperature exchange you get. See, this one's 27 degrees, this one's 70 degrees, this one's 230 degrees. And then this one over here, where it's coming down from, is actually 400 degrees. So this is the actual end one. But the longer we run this for, the more all of these elements will heat up in sequence, and the more heat will actually get exchanged. Which means we don't need to dump all of the heat from the metal refinery. So what you'll actually want to do is you'll want to set this high to start with, to get all of these elements heated up. And then once they're heated up, most of the heat is going to be coming from the preheating, and you can decrease the liquid flow rate through the beta valve to suit that. Because that's really what you want. You want continuous operation. You want a constant amount of iron and rust coming through this setup, so that it's constantly melting, constantly exchanging heat, and you're getting the most preheating out possible. So you can run this as little as possible. But it's going to take a little while to heat all these elements, so we're going to come back after this is run at 10 kilograms per second of uranium, after a few cycles, and we'll see how that goes. But I'm sure we'll make a load of steel in the meantime. So we've been letting this run for a little while now, and some of the elements have heated up to quite a high temperature. So you can see here, at the end of this row now, I've got it at 23 degrees, and then gradually the temperature of these blocks is increasing in steps, and we're getting the rust fairly hot before it actually all melts. So on this conveyor in particular, you can see the rust is currently at about 1430-ish degrees C. So that's pretty good. That means we're preheating the rust most of the way, and we have to eject relatively little heat from the metal refinery, so this is good. It's not quite 100% behaving how I wanted it to, because we were running this metal refinery for quite a long time, so the coolant has ended up quite a bit hotter than rust melting temperatures. Ideally, you don't want it this hot, because at this point we're transferring so much heat into the rust that it's actually melting in this tile as well. So we're getting a little bit of iron dropping over here, and a little bit dropping over here. But that's not too bad. It basically just means that these two blocks are sort of connected together at the moment, which is not ideal, but it's still functioning properly. We're still actually getting the continuous running of the iron through these elements. And again, the longer this runs for, the less spiky it's going to get with the heat. And also, the longer we leave it running for, this coolant in the metal refinery will actually cool down once we get through it all, because we're cooling this all down by several hundred degrees at this point in a row. So eventually it will normalize. You'll get a bit less actual heat dropping out from this tile. You can see this door's closed again, so that's actually transferred the heat over from this tile a bit more easily. That means it's actually cooled down a little bit more over here now. The rust is still coming in at a high temperature, so we're still getting a lot of that preheating going on. This does sort itself out eventually. The main takeaway is just make sure this pipe is ceramic. I would also replace this pipe with ceramic, because if you've got any iron that ends up in this tile, eventually it will melt an insulated pipe tile. So just make sure that any pipes that you have actually running through this rust melting area are ceramic if you have it. These two tiles in particular, maybe this tile, make these ceramic. The rest could wait, but eventually you're probably going to want to replace it all with ceramic just in case. But there it is. It's actually just running continuously now, and it will get more efficient over time. But you can see we're making all of the iron. It's coming out at 1 kilogram per second, and if we want to increase the flow rate, we can. If for some reason you need more than 3 metal volcanoes worth of iron at a time, you can increase this to 2 kilograms per second or 4 kilograms per second. The issue is, the larger the packets get, the less conductive they are over such a short space where we're actually trying to melt everything. So you do reach a point where it stops running the iron out continuously, and it does it in bursts if you try and do more. So you do get a little bit of diminishing returns. But I've run this at 2 kilograms per second and 4 kilograms per second fairly well. If you're doing that, you'll want to increase the flow rate of uranium through the liquid meter valve a little bit more than twice as much, just to add that extra conductivity to the tile and make sure the rust is melting a bit quicker. But 1 kilogram per second, I think, is the sweet spot overall, because it's A, the amount of metal that you're likely to use, and B, the packets are small enough that it conducts fairly neatly and you can get the continuous operation going. But yeah, as this runs, it's going to keep sort of evening out in temperature, and it's all going to be good. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on rust melting, or at least how I've done it in my games so far. Let me know how you like to do your rust melting. The build on Reddit at the moment that's really popular actually uses liquid iron. So what it does is it melts all the iron, and then it uses pitcher pumps and trickery to actually get the iron into a liquid pipe. And then it uses a liquid meter valve here to actually run it at 1 kilogram per second. 1 kilogram per second through a pipe, so that way it doesn't actually... You can run the iron all the way down to room temperature and it doesn't burst in the pipe. And because you've actually got a liquid and the conveyor in the same pipe, you can actually set up the matrix for actually cooling all the elements. Something like this, where you actually have the conveyor rail going one way, like this. And then you have the actual liquid pipe with the iron in it, the liquid iron, going like this. And then, because you can fit the liquid pipe and you can fit the conveyor rail in the same tile, it does make it a lot more space efficient. You can fit a lot more heat exchange tiles in per unit space. But the reality is, you don't actually need a huge amount of space anyways with this spread out approach to actually get everything operating. Like, you can see here, like, we've actually got this sort of pretty close to the rust melting temperature already with all of these elements. And the more you have, the better it will be in the long term. But like you can see, we've actually bled most of the heat out of the iron at this point anyways. Now, here's a question. Why is this heating up? What is the cause of this? I think it's... Oh, the rust is literally just coming in hotter. Yeah, the rust is coming in hotter than 20 degrees. So that's why we're seeing it look like this. Don't worry, it's fine. But yeah, it's all running properly. You can build something like this in your base. Obviously, the metal refinery is generating a fair bit of heat, but that's literally just the heat we generated from the metal refinery earlier. These items have stayed relatively cool despite the fact we're running all this hot metal through them. The coolant in the polluted water pipe is running through this water. That's going fine. You are going to have a little bit of heat generation from the items overall, so you probably will want some active base cooling at some point anyways, but it's not such a huge amount of heat that it's going to be prohibitive for your dupe's safety. So, definitely something to consider. I like it. I like that you can just fit the metal refinery in and then just have the rust actually being melted directly above the metal refinery. And really, you can lay out your heat exchanger however you want, but I like to do it like this because then you can just fit it into a chunk of your base with the insulation. But the key takeaways are: make pipes that are interacting with refined liquid iron out of ceramic if you have it. Make sure that your conveyor bridges are entirely within insulated tiles or entirely without. Do not have them dip into an insulated tile, otherwise the insulated tile will heat up. But you can see all of this insulated tile has stayed nice and cold, so the rust melter itself isn't leaking any heat into the base. The only heat that we're getting over here is from the pipes containing the uranium, and again, you can make these out of ceramic as well, and just the actual running of the metal refinery, because we ran this metal refinery to produce 5 tons of steel. That's why it's hot in this area. But yeah, thanks for tuning in. This is going to be the last video for a while, because I'm going on holiday. We're going to be in Australia for like a month. So yeah, I'm actually going. Take it away, Whiskers, and I'll see you guys towards Halloween. Bye for now.
Whiskers sends thanks to the following Twitch subscribers and YouTube members: 999999999, Ayla Ivo, Lagbot 30000, Quantum Zari, Stinger's Playground, Sweet Danger Kitty, The Brute Man, Uglavisk, User 4101, and Christian Nielsen 9363.